acceptable or palatable to conservatives, not to alienate those people in the party. Would you be surprised if it turned out that Bush did have a rather drastically different agenda from Ronald Reagan?
Drastically different, yes. I'd be amazed at that. That he is different in many respects, no, I'm not surprised about that. That he would approach things a little differently than Reagan, no, certainly not. He is not Ronald Reagan, he's George Bush. And he has his own way of approaching each and every problem that he has to resolve. And I'm sure that his approach will, in many respects, be somewhat different. But the philosophy, I think, between Reagan and Bush is almost identical in their approach to what federal government should be in the lives of the American people.
It would seem to make sense that if you have these two friendly administrations, that George Bush following Ronald Reagan, he would not want to come in and make a lot of changes quickly.
Sure, but there's one event that I keep going back to, and that's the first week of the Bush candidacy, when he came out and did the newspaper interviews, did the television talk shows, and he said, I want to be the education president. One of two interpretations of that. I'm the front runner, I've got it in the bag, so I'm going to talk about something non-controversial because the federal government has little role to play in education. Or he's really not as conservative as you might indicate, Pete, because that's not a President Reagan's stand at all. I mean, he did a lot of cutting and slashing in those few federal programs that affect education. So I'm not sure on that basis. And to go back to John's point on the various tasks that George Bush has had and his ideas and whether or not he formulates ideas, in his acceptance speech, and of course sometimes the symbolism of those are important, but certainly he signed off on the idea that this was another mission, and that was the theme of the speech. And he's had a glorious, courageous portfolio that most would be very envious to have. And yet, the mission concept is someone gives me marching orders and I go off and I complete the mission. This is one mission that's a little bit different, President of the United States. And I do think that, and I would stand on the side that he's still looking for an agenda. And the danger is in the area of foreign policy that you let events overtake you. Now, this wouldn't be the first administration that had that problem. I'm not sure we've had a coordinated foreign policy maybe since the middle of the 50s. But this is a danger of this kind of a presidency.
If it's not fair to judge a president at the end of 100 days, how fair is it to judge a vice president? But hey, we'll do it anyway. Dan Quayle, are you happy with Vice President Dan Quayle, David?
Well, I think Dan Quayle, I don't think was expecting to be selected as vice president. I think it come to him unsuspectingly. And I think it's typical of anyone who, at that age, someone would ask him to be a vice presidential candidate, and suddenly you wake up being vice president. He's had a lot of adjustment to do. Being a U.S. senator and going from that to a U.S. vice president is a traumatic experience. I think it's going to be time. I think as he goes through the job, and we're seeing that he is getting higher approval ratings as he is maturing into the job, and I think in the end of a year, maybe 2 years, that you're going to see a more mature Dan Quayle, and one who is more readily accepted by the U.S. populace.
Can we tell anything about Dan Quayle in 100 days, John?
Oh, I don't think the vice president's very important. I said the presidency wasn't very important.
So.
The vice presidency is really not important unless something happens to Bush, and then we got a true constitutional crisis in this country. So let's just hope that nothing happens to George Bush and everything is. You know, I think one nice thing about this country is that the American people run the country really when it comes down to it. I mean, the really nice thing about America is that happens, and who really cares about who's president or vice president in a sense. The really great thing is that the people run this country. So Dan Quayle, he's just another citizen.
Pete?
I'm absolutely delighted with what Dan's done in the first 100 days. The guy reaffirms all my very high opinions of him. I thought he was an excellent United States Senator, and he was. I think he'll prove to be an excellent vice president in whatever capacity George Bush utilizes him in. I'm gratified that Bush is including him and using him in the administration. I think that he's got considerable talent in Dan. And I think Dan will do an exemplary job, and he'll make us proud as Americans, and he'll make us proud as Hoosiers, too.
Bush isn't hiding Quayle in a closet, Ralph. At least he's sending him, but he is sending him overseas. Is there any hint of how he will use him? Will he can use him as something of an ambassador, a roving ambassador?
That's the way vice presidents are often used. In some ways, this is just an extension of how he was used in the campaign, going to out of media center schoolrooms with 6th grade students. It's a somewhat similar vein. I guess I'm a curmudgeon because it's final week. I think I disagree with all the panelists. I think the presidency is important. I don't think the people run this country at all, except in the most basic ways. And I'm not very pleased with Quayle's selection or his performance. I think they've just hidden him. I think the important point is that will he be ready? It's kind of like warming up the relief pitcher. And in that event that no one wants, would he be ready to be president? And I think this does go back to Bush's leadership skills. The caucus did not make very many good points at all during the campaign, but I think that was one that he made, that this was an unusual decision. Quayle, just by his very presence, doesn't seem to have the intellectual abilities to deal with this. Hopefully that'll change, and I hope he is learning the job, and I think giving him a chance and keeping him out of the media's light is the best way to do it. It's not only good politics, but I think it's good government.
Yeah, I think one thing we can say for George Bush, as Peter has indicated, is that George Bush is the connected president. I mean, he's connected in the sense that he's known people on both sides of the aisle for 25, 30 years. He is connected to the corporate sector. He's connected. Whereas by comparison, Dan Quayle is not connected. He just doesn't have the experience. He just doesn't have the connections. He is not admired in the same way that Peter would like for him to be admired by various politicians of both sides of the aisle. He's inexperienced, and his inexperience, if he would become president, I think would lead us to a real constitutional crisis, and we would be in a real uncertain time. That's how uncertain I feel about Dan Quayle.
You have to realize there's an age difference between George Bush and Dan Quayle. And I'm sure if you would look back at George Bush when he was 41 years of age, you might see a very similar Dan Quayle. They're different in, you mentioned about Bush's connections and with the corporate structure and the legislature. They're different because George Bush has been there longer. And Dan Quayle is John F. Kennedy's age when John F. Kennedy became president, or very close to it.
But I would say that John F. Kennedy was probably a lot more connected in terms of his experience than Dan Quayle was with his, has been with his.
Well, his dad was a lot more connected maybe than Jim was, in the sense that his dad was involved actively in National Democrat politics during Franklin Delano Roosevelt's time. But I think, John, I don't want to be sounding the negative horn over here all the time, but I think you're, again, dead wrong about Dan Quayle. Dan is a bright guy. Dan is a capable guy. Dan did an excellent job for us in the United States Senate. He is well respected by the United States Senate. He's well respected by everybody that knows him. And I think your concerns are unfounded. I hope we never have to find out how unfounded they truly are, but I think your concerns are really
If he's bright and capable, Pete, he's better on television than Ronald Reagan ever was, because he certainly doesn't come off as bright or capable. Now, maybe he is in other settings, but he has the most glassy-eyed look I've ever seen when hit with a question.
Ralph, I'm just glad to hear Republicans quoting John Kennedy.
I hear a Senator Benson quote floating around this studio, but we won't go over that.
And you know, as we look back to the Kennedy time, we look back with a whole lot of problems about how young he was and how many mistakes he made because he was so young. And so I don't think any of us can defend the mistakes and the problems that came out of that time in terms of inexperience. And I say the same thing if Dan Quayle would become president.
Pete, what do you want to see out of George Bush and Dan Quayle in the next 9 months? What do you want to see in their first year of their administration? Do you have any expectations?
I would like to see a balanced budget. Now, and I realize I'm not going to see that because there are a lot of different problems in the Congress that are not going to produce that for us. I would like to see us reach some kind of accord with our NATO allies on the deployment of certain of our nuclear weapons, our field-grade nuclear weapons. I would like to see us continue our dialogue with the Soviet Union and see if there are some other areas where we can work on arms reduction that will mutually benefit both of us. I don't want any unilateral arms reduction on our side.
Like the genie in a bottle, you just get 3 wishes. So those are your 3. We're out of time. Thanks to John Rouse and Ralph Baker for being with us. David Taylor, Pete Drum for your comments today. I'm Larry Lough. Thank you for being with us.